This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 149. Will higher oil prices drive alternative energy investment?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen, and I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, will higher oil prices drive alternative energy investment? Oil prices are, of course, highly volatile, but even though he keeps saying he wants prices lower, President Trump is helping constrain supply from Iran and Venezuela. Well, constrain's perhaps a bit of a tame word. Totally eradicate, really. So will that push oil prices higher? After all, we are seeing Brent crude prices closer to $80 a barrel now. So, as fossil fuels become more expensive, does that mean we'll start to shift towards environmentally sustainable alternatives? Could supply and price be the planet's savior? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, Steve, I do wonder whether Donald Trump is actually a closet environmentalist, because at the surface level, it doesn't sound like it, does it? I mean, he is pro-oil, he's removed environmental protections, he's approved pipelines, and he's pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, of course. But on the other side, he is stopping this flow of oil from Iran and Venezuela. That's helping to elevate prices. So does that mean if oil prices go up, does that mean we're more likely to switch to more environmentally friendly alternatives if the prices stay higher for longer?
Oh, well, as you like anything Donald Trump ever does, it's if it does anything good, it's an accident. But in that particular case, it's in the very short term, it doesn't have any impact upon switching over, because you can't just decide, oh damn, oil's too expensive today, I'll fuel my car with solar power instead. You've got to change the infrastructure.
It's got to be sustained. But if it was sustained, it was as high as $148 a barrel back in 2008. It's been hovering around $80 a barrel for most of last year. Then it dipped. Then it came back up again. It's sort of pretty close to that level. And we know that oil reserves are getting low as well. So it could get higher. So, if it becomes consistent, then from what you're saying, well, yes, we would start to look at alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly are already, because that's one reason I'm, regardless of what else happens, I'm going to remain a fan of Elon Musk, because he's made electric cars sexy. Whether they're the solution or not is another story.
Have you ever driven a Tesla?
No, and I do want to. Have you?
It is. I tell you, it is unreal. You will never be happy in any other car after you've driven one.
That's exactly what I've heard from most people who've driven one. And I want my petrol head. I've got one of my best mates back in Australia. He qualifies as a petrol head. It's mainly on motorbikes that he's a petrol head rather than cars. But he sort of poo-poos them as, oh my God, they've got no, look at them, how ugly they are. There's no sex appeal, yada, yada, yada. My basic is, you put your foot on the accelerator, mate, and you're going to feel sex.
Yeah, I know. It is incredible how they pull away. Absolutely incredible. I mean, 0 to 60 in I don't know how many seconds, but I mean, just when you're on a motorway and you've got a very short run on, and you're going, if you've virtually stopped, you can be at the speed of the traffic by the end of the run on the motorway. Yeah. So
but that raises one of the issues as well, which is onto the counterpoint. Sort of one of the groups that I follow on Twitter, Limits to Growth, makes, and also Tim Garrett, my research associate, now on the role of energy, and that is that what we tend to do when we find more efficient ways of using energy, we don't use less, we use more energy. And so this is a whole question, how much energy goes into the Tesla itself, and what is the actual energy implications of continuing to use roads for transportation? Even Teslas are going to get stuck in traffic jams.
And will we drive more because it's such a pleasant experience driving a Tesla? We say, well, let's drive 3 times as much.
Exactly. And this actually goes back to what's called the Jevons paradox. And one of the few times I'm going to quote favorably a father of neoclassical economics, as the Jevons pointed out, that was what he'd seen historically as well. When we found more efficient ways of using energy, we used more energy, we didn't use less. And the question comes back to, is it a case that we simply have to find more efficient ways of using energy, or do we have to use less energy? And on that case, the evidence that I see, particularly from Tim Garrett's work, but also what I've been doing myself, and looking at the things like the overshoot we can see in the human ecological footprint, knowing the levels of carbon we've got at the moment, even if it didn't raise issues about more carbon going into the atmosphere, which of course it does, there's still an issue. We may have to drastically reduce energy consumption for something of the nature of the next 40 to 60 years if we're going to make life on this planet sustainable.
So is more expensive energy going to do that then? Because so if oil became more expensive, then okay, we might go to alternatives, but those alternatives are not going to be as cheap as oil used to be. So we're still paying more for energy. So does that mean we will use less energy than we used to because we're paying more for it?
Well, that again comes part of the context is, can we do this while maintaining the level of consumption we currently, inverted commas, enjoy? And I'm using it in inverted commas two reasons. One, a lot of consumption is wasteful. We know the side effects of it, and we, of course, don't have an even distribution of it around the planet. But if we imagine, can we manage to make the transition from the high carbon and high energy world we have now to a future world which is also high energy but low carbon? The information I'm seeing, and again, I know more than most people in this, but I would not yet call myself an expert. What I can see, the two are incompatible. We have such a level of, and this is not just, in some ways, actually, I'm glad we've got global warming, because it's such a major large-scale issue and obvious at the same time in terms of, we're feeling that, apart from us that belong to the flat Earth society that also believe global warming is conspiracy and the place is getting cooler, most of us are experiencing it and have seen it in our own lifetimes. And it implies, if we're going to do anything about it, we have to do a major rework of human society. Now, that is much more visible than what's happening, and this is something which I've only realised by seeing recent writing about it and then putting my own mind back over my own personal history. They're now calling the Insectageddon, because if you go for a drive now from, let's take a Sydney, Australian location, if you go from Sydney to Burke, or if you're in Europe, you drive from London, if you drive from Amsterdam to Paris, you're not going to be spending most of your time wiping insects off the windshield because they're not there anymore. But I vividly remember as a child in my father's car going for long family holidays from Sydney to Port Macquarie and ultimately to Walgett as well, that it was just keep them windscreen wipers going, wash them insects off.
Well, I hate to disagree with you on this one. I just drove back from the Lake District a week ago, and our windscreen was smothered in insects. So they are still around. They're just choosing carefully where they go. But look, if
I'm glad you're finding them there, because that's good news.
Everywhere else they've gone. Yeah, that isn't it. Well, so the environment is changing. We need to do something about it. And we sort of know that. But the question is, how much of that can be driven by economics? So if the price of oil or energy generally rises, then are we going to use less of it? Are we going to sort of manage to find a way where we say, okay, well, we need to use energy more efficiently, but still have the same outputs? So we need to be more careful about how we use it. We need new processes which are going to be less energy intensive that are still going to get the same results for us.
And will the price rise and motivate all those things? Back to the first point. This is one of the issues that actually is coming up in the two what look like very opposing public protests right now, but actually have a very common core, and that's the Gilets jaunes in Paris, in France, and the Extinction Rebellion in London, which of course that's now going. They're both in various ways gone global. But the point of the reason that the Gilets jaunes first occurred was a proposal by Macron to put up fuel taxes.
And
was going to start in 2019, and on November 17. We had the first of the Gilets jaunes protests. They date back in terms of development to sometime in October, from what I can tell. But that was saying, no way, we can't afford it. We are already, and this is the we we're talking about, are effectively the dispossessed the dispossessed and disenfranchised of France. They're the people who don't live in Paris, who don't have comfortable high incomes from the globalized world that Paris is part of, and who have to drive to work each day because they don't live in Paris where there's a great metro, and they're driving in cars which are, a large number of them have become diesel, whether they're working in trucks which have always been predominantly diesel, or the cars that French in particular switched over to diesel back when it was seen as an environmentally advantageous fuel, which is not
right.
the case.
But that is a symptom, isn't it? I mean, you could easily say, well, okay, we're going to give you subsidies to try and compensate for the fact that if you've got an old car, you need to shift. The issue, though, is that they're saying, well, we can't afford to do that because we're so disenfranchised because the rich-poor gap is so big.
Yeah.
So if that didn't exist, if the gap wasn't so wide, they wouldn't be so worried about these things.
Exactly. And I think this is the problem about trying to use price. And of course, carbon tax affects price. That's literally what it has to do. It puts the price up. Is price the rationing mechanism we need? And this is where we come to a clash between the neoclassical vision of price as an allocated mechanism between different products and the reality, I'm afraid to say, which is more what the post-Keynesian world looks like theoretically, that price is an allocation mechanism between workers and capitalists in the twofold way. You first of all have a wage bargain, of course, which is something which sets the monetary value of the wage, but because the monetary value of the wage is one of the major inputs to the cost of production in manufacturing, and that then leads back to a response by manufacturers who will may or may not put up prices in response to the wage rises, and the two affect each other in a counteracting way. Now, what the post-Keynesians therefore see the role of prices is fundamentally an allocation mechanism between workers and capitalists. Now, if you had the income level of the 50s and 60s, relative income levels, then the impact would not be so great. But given the extent to which workers have suffered through globalization in the West in particular, and also the point that I make out that the rising level of private debt is actually paid for by a lower wage share for workers, it's the workers who are copping it. And if you try to do the entire thing through the price mechanism, it's basically saying if you're poor, you're going to pay for carbon, you're going to pay for fighting carbon. If you're rich, it doesn't matter. You can afford the fuel. You can even afford the Tesla.
But isn't it, which would be nice, wouldn't it? Oh, God, I wish, because they are such good cars to drive. Have I mentioned that? But look, the most of the cost is, and that it is unfortunate. As I say, maybe you can find ways around it through subsidies, or maybe the focus shouldn't be on the individual. It should be on businesses, because it's businesses we want to shift, isn't it? We want them to say, yes, find an alternative. Energy has been too cheap. You're using it in a way where it is a throwaway resource. Well, obviously it is a throwaway resource, but you need to use less of it and still try and achieve the same productivity. You just need to think harder about it. It might be more expensive, but that's going to be the thing that is going to force you to try and find new ways.
Yeah, that's the thought about how to do it. But again, the question becomes: will those businesses pass the costs on? What will they do again to workers already complaining? They're barely managing to survive. There's the people, particularly those who live in what they call the gig economy, which we're on to in one of our next discussions. They are already effectively on the breadline. They pay their own transportation costs. They pay their own food and everything else costs as well. If those other costs go in response to an increase in taxes to business, it's still the workers who are going to say, I can't cope with this. So my feeling is, and this is it's not something we're going to see in the next 10 years, maybe not in the next 10 years, but I think certainly in the next 20, we're going to be seeing ourselves in a world where we have actual official war-style rationing. And when you impose the costs, not by making something more expensive, but by meaning you can get less of it no matter how much you can afford to pay for it. And that was the mechanism that kept costs, one of the mechanisms.
Well, doesn't that push prices up, though? I mean, if you're limiting the resource for something, isn't that going to push the price of it up?
No, again, because this was, again, done during the Second World War. And, in fact, a leading non-orthodox economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, played a major role in this. Is another one. I think I remember the name Mead was involved there, and Gardner Means. And they were all involved in the attempts to do twofold: to restrict the amount of fuel that was being used for consumption and ordinary manufacturing, to increase the amount that would be available for war manufacturing, and do it in such a way that it didn't cause a major inflationary surge. There was inflation during the Second World War in America in particular, but nothing like the scale you'd imagine if you just had a typical neoclassical idea about, well, if you ration something, the price is going to rise. Because what you do by rationing as well, you reduce the amount of demand that is allowed to occur. And that therefore means you don't get that high level of demand, cut back the supply, bang, price is going to rise in a sort of neoclassical fashion. You get there's less demand for it. because we simply won't allow you to express that demand no matter how much money you have.
Right. Okay. That sort of makes sense. And that explains, sort of answers the next question I was going to ask. Because if we look at...
we better forget it then.
Yeah, forget it. Okay, I won't ask it. No, I'm going to... Let's go back to talking about driving a Tesla. It was so good. No. Look, the question I was going to ask was, just because we do limit, of course, the supply of oil, because we've got a cartel that, by and large, it's weakening now, obviously, because of the massive reserves of shale oil in the United States. But OPEC controls the amount of oil, and they do that to control the price, don't they?
Well, they did that way back in the early 1970s. And actually, it's well worth people taking a look if they haven't actually seen these things, a price of oil over time. And there's one enormous spike in the early 1970s and another enormous spike in the late 1970s. And they were both the original manifestation of what you're talking about there, which was OPEC, which, of course, was predominantly the Middle Eastern countries and originally very much so Saudi Arabia. Pardon me, mate, with a catch in my throat. They realised they were being screwed by what they
It's all those insects you're swallowing.
Almost insects, that's right. Yeah, they're flying in through my window in Amsterdam. They realised they were being screwed. What used to be known as the Seven Sisters, the major oil companies, all owned by the ex-colonial powers, particularly America, the UK, and Holland, the Netherlands, where I currently am. And they were just getting a tiny amount of the money that's coming out of all the oil that was coming out of their oil fields. And basically, OPEC said is enough. They did this in the context of what was, I think, the biggest boom in the history of capitalism. And that was the boom of the business from 69 to 73. And at the end of that boom, you had wage rises being demanded by workers. Of course, unemployment was low globally. You then had this OPEC price rise coming in. They put the price up from $2.50 a barrel to $10. Also in the context of the Yom Kippur War, which, of course, the Israelis won very dramatically. This was the 7-day war, I think. Was it the 7-day war? And in retaliation to that loss, effectively, it was another reason why OPEC was formed to put up the price from $2.50 a barrel to $10. Then you had, towards the end of 79, you had another period of nothing like the boom of the 1973, but another period of tight economic activity. And in that situation, the price quadrupled again from $10 to $40. Now, that when you're looking at that level of the price back then, when it's deflated by into current prices terms, is actually a price of $120 a barrel. The only time it's been higher than that was just before the global financial crisis. Again, you had another boom going on there. Again, workers' wage rises were getting higher. And you had the price spiking up to $160 a barrel in inflation-adjusted terms.
So if we were to say, well, let's insist that oil is $150 a barrel, for example, and if it isn't that level, we're going to tax it up to that level, and we used all that extra money to invest in alternative technology. So we either get a tax revenue or the producers go, well, hell no, if you're going to tax it, we may as well sell it to you for $150. So they make bigger profits, which they may well use to invest in alternative technologies. I mean, that's or they may just give it to their shareholders, of course. But that's
or they go back to try to find more oil.
Because it's a good margin. Yeah, okay.
This is one of the dilemmas. The idea that the price mechanism works as an allocation system is one of the myths that's heavily ingrained into people's thinking because of that classic, intersecting supply and demand curve argument. And what we find instead is that for most products, when you look at the supply curve, if you could actually draw one, what you get is something that slopes downwards. It's actually cheaper to produce in higher volume in manufacturing. Now, oil is an exception to that because when you, not in the case of the Saudi Arabian fields necessarily, but in the case of the American system and the undersea oil fields and so on, if you want to get more out, then to some extent you've got to pump more. A lot of the oil actually just literally comes out of the ground. The old Beverly Hillbillies, where you shoot a shotgun at a rabbit and oil comes out of the ground. That's how it used to be under the high pressure that used to exist in the original fields and still does in some of the larger ones. So you've got to basically stop it coming out of the ground as fast as it wants to. But when you start getting to the level of some of the more exotic fields, and I like particularly the shale oil and thinking about the tar sands in Canada, then you've got to put more energy in to get more energy out. And this is the crucial point, that all this is in the context of an economics economic theory is completely barren on this point. It's only worth getting energy out of the ground if the amount of energy you've got to put in to get it is less than the amount of energy you get out from doing it. And this is the big crunch that is still, we're putting it off into the future by thinking.
But that stands to reason. You wouldn't. I mean, surely it stands to reason that if you're putting energy in, then you've got a cost associated with that, and if you're not recouping that cost from the energy you're producing, then you haven't got an economic business.
Well, unfortunately, sometimes you can have an economic business that way because often it's possible the energy cost you pay to get energy out of the ground can be less than the price you get on the stuff you actually mine. So the price system doesn't work perfectly, and you do get distortions like that make it possible people will continue mining even though they're putting more energy in joules and they're getting out in joules. The price of what they're paying for can be less than the price that they sell the other stuff for. However, the fundamental rule in energy research is that it's only possible to have a viable human civilization if there's a large gap between the amount of energy you put in to get energy back out. And if you look back at the early, the Beverly Hillbilly days and prior to that, the level of energy in to get a level amount of energy back from oil was of the order of 100 or more to 1. And that's why oil is such a dense product. This is the other thing which people, again, because we just don't think enough about it, we don't realize what it's like. The amount of energy in a petrol tank, if you let it off all at once, could destroy a building. It's an enormous amount of energy in a very compact form. And because it's held in fields that are, underneath faults, under high pressure, all you've got to do is drill a hole down, which takes a certain amount of energy. And when you break into that reservoir,
it shoots out.
It's a gusher. The term used to be, it's a gusher. Yeah. We've got a gusher.
Well, this is why the Saudis have so much influence, isn't it? Because they have such an excess of this oil and they're not using it for their own domestic consumption. So in the United States, I mean, they are increasing oil production, but a lot of it is met by domestic demand rather than export demand. So when you start looking at who's exporting and who has the most influence, it is countries like Saudi Arabia, because it is such a big part of their balance of trade is the oil that they're exporting, and they can really set the price, can't they?
Yeah, well, that's what's been the situation pretty much since the 1970s,
and it's not changed too much.
Well, it's changed in terms of because once the price goes up, as you pointed out, then it makes profitable to consider other fields which have higher production costs, but still below the sale cost. So like the Saudis have claimed to have oil cost productions as low in modern day terms as $4 a barrel and certainly below $10 a barrel. Okay,
well, let's look at this another way then. If we didn't have these artificial boundaries called countries, if we were looking at it from the most efficient way for the world, we'd be saying, well, yes, let's use the oil in Saudi Arabia. If they've got loads of it, it's, as you say, it's cheaper to access, uses less energy to access. Let's forget about shale oil.
Yeah, and then we come back to the issue when the whole situation. Once we do that, we're burning carbon, and we know we can't afford to burn carbon.
Yeah.
And so we have a real dilemma. And the question is, when we have to make a transition to non-carbon-based fuel sources, and the scale of that transition is something people just don't have their heads around. Because if you think about the amount of energy you're using, if you hop in your car and drive 100 kilometres, the amount of energy that is tied up in that is phenomenal. And if we want to go to replacing that by having an energy source which doesn't come from carbon, we simply don't have the production facilities for that at the moment. And to build them in the first place would involve a lot of use of, guess what, carbon-based fuels, because you need energy to make it. You need energy to mine energy. So this is the bind we're in. Like Tim Garrett's calculations, in terms of the amount of energy we'd need to replace carbon-based so that we stabilise current energy output, is something in the order of building a 300 megawatt power station a day. To actually reduce it substantially, you're talking a gigawatt power station per day. Now, we don't have the engineering capabilities to build that many at the one time. And if we do try to redirect the energy we currently have towards that purpose, then the energy available, what the rest of us are doing, falls off drastically.
But what about, the how long oil is going to last for? I mean, this has been part of the problem, hasn't it? If we go back to like it was the 1950s when M. King Hubbert said, we were going to reach peak oil, and he said 1996 was when he said it was going to hit. But he was wrong, because those predictions have all been foiled by unconventional sources of oil, like the shale that we talked about, which now forms a much larger part of the whole mix. 8.4 million barrels a day now the US is pumping out. A lot of that is shale oil. So that wasn't seen back in the 1950s. So why this focus on us saying, well, okay, we need to find more energy now? We still go for oil or gas, and we just go for as you say, a less energy efficient way of extracting this. Why is that still more cost effective than using other alternatives?
Well, let's go back. King Hubbert actually was right, because he was talking about conventional oil sources. The peak oil did occur at the times he gave, and that's all quite correct. What he didn't talk about was finding new ways to get oil out of other substances, which is where the shale oil thing came in. And this is partly what neoclassical economists argue, that if the price gets to be high enough, then we will exploit alternative sources. Now, the point which the neoclassicals don't have their heads around, and that includes Nordhaus, is that if you do that, then what you have is by finding an alternative energy source, which means you don't run out of the energy, you have another source of carbon, which means you're producing too much carbon.
Yeah.
And
this is during the transition period. Yeah.
Well, the double, triple, and quadruple bind we're in is that we have to, when we look at the level of climate change that we are seeing already, and what's feasible if the carbon continues rising at current rates, we are talking an existential threat for the species. Now, that is not included in the way economists advise politicians about the impacts of climate change, because they ludicrously, and I've just been researching this a moment ago, and even given the low opinion I have of economists to begin with, it still limbos below that particular bar, the way they calculated the cost of carbon changing over to non-carbon sources, and the cost of increasing carbon now. We can't, they're drastically underestimating the cost that's going to involve. So we are very complacently running into a point where the climate is going to tell us, you put any more in here and we're going to give you cyclones in London. And when it starts at the stage we are really going to see serious shifts in what the climate does to us because of what we've done to the climate, then we're going to say, holy hell, we have to change over rapidly. And we've got nowhere near fast enough in making that transition.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that we need to go through this transition period. So it is cheaper. It is becoming cheaper to use alternative energy sources. So Lazard is an asset management company, a pretty big one. They've analysed what they've called the levelised cost of energy, how much it costs to produce per megawatt hour. And wind now, they reckon, is $45 compared to $135 back in 2009. Utility scale solar, in other words, big solar farms, $50 compared to $360 back in 2009. So we've seen a big decrease. Compare that to coal. That $50 for solar compares to $102 for coal, which hasn't really moved much. Nuclear actually increasing, $148. It was $111 back in 2009. So we can see it's getting cheaper. But your point is, but to make all this stuff, you need to use energy which has probably come from fossil fuels, and you're going to need to use a heck of a lot of it to try and make this transition. Yeah. And we're not going to be able to use a heck of a lot of it if we start to push up the price of those fossil fuels. It'll make all of these things uneconomic because we are pushing the price up of energy.
Well, making the transition, we'll have to devote so much of our available energy, carbon-based, to creating forms of energy mining that are non-carbon based, that the amount left over for us to consume is going to have to fall quite drastically. And I believe if you did it by putting the price up to make it fall, you'd have gilets jaunes everywhere on the bloody planet, because it'll be the working class who can't afford to get to work.
Yeah.
And therefore,
plus the cost of wind would go up because the cost of building the wind farms has gone up because you're using fossil fuel energy to create it in the first place.
Yeah, and you've got to pay money for the provide. So if you put up the price of doing that, then you have other feedbacks which undermine what you're trying to achieve. Yeah. So the real dilemma is we have this, and this is just in terms of the energy we're consuming right now, not looking at whether we're consuming too much energy in terms of what we're dumping into the planet in terms of waste, mainly in the form of carbon dioxide as well, but also in terms of how much of the wild environment we're devoting to our own purposes rather than to the needs of the planet to have those wild purposes to regenerate things like, for example, insects, which we spoke about a short while ago. So the struggle is that when we first developed wind and solar, the energy return and energy invested was extremely low. Now, this is a very, unfortunately, rubbery figure, because what's called the energy return on energy invested, EROI, looks at what's the total amount of energy you put in to getting energy out of a particular source. And the amount you measure depends on whether you say, are we going to return the environment to the state it was in before we dug that coal mine? Are we going to decommission that floating oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico? And when people do the calculations for solar, they say, are we going to remove those panels and recycle them after they cease working? Now, from my cynical looking at how we do all this stuff, we don't generally regenerate. There are some regeneration projects for mining sites, definitely, but frequently we'll leave the hole in the ground and fill it up with other waste later. So to some extent, I think maybe the EROI calculations for solar and wind implying we're going to have to decommission, and we include that in the cost. I think that's exaggerating the cost. But nonetheless, when you look at these things, they started at a very low energy return and energy invested of the order of 5 to 1, whereas oil started about 150 to 1. Now, as we use more oil, we've been heading further and further down because we've been pushed into things like getting oil out of the North Sea. And I just saw recently that, thank God, thank bless their cotton socks, every surfer in Australia except Tony Abbott seems to be opposed to mining oil in the Great Australian Bight. Demos against that. But you've got enormous cost to mine in those regions. So the energy return on energy invested in oil is falling, while at the same time the energy return on energy invested on solar and wind is rising. But we are really like a final episode of Star Trek. We've got to resolve this in the final 30 seconds. Yeah. And in the middle, we've got higher costs to actually build this stuff and relatively low energy yields coming out of it. And below a certain energy yield of the order of about the 7 to 1 return, you really can't maintain an advanced society, which is where I come back to my rationing issue once more.
Yeah. Or do we get the Saudis to help out with all of this? So if we look at, in the United States, for example, we've got people, we've got shale oil, which is becoming economic because oil prices have risen. But shale oil, as we know, it needs lots of water, and if it's not controlled, it can pollute groundwater. The plants emit nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide into the air. It's far worse for the environment than conventional oil extraction. And that's before we start, burning the oil to drive our cars or do what we want with it. But if the Saudis, if it was uneconomic or just illegal to do that, the one thing you can say about Britain is, even though we've got shale oil, it's not going to get very far, because the moment there's a slight earth tremor, they have to close them down. And we had the oil czar saying a couple of weeks ago that it's just not going to work in this country because there's going to be too much opposition for it. Different story in the United States. But if we got rid of that, if we just said, well, this is a crazy way to deal with fossil fuels, and we look back at Saudi Arabia and say, whereas you guys have got a really good way of extracting fossil fuels, so let's do that because that uses the least energy to do it, and let's use the money that you're getting from that to look into those alternative technologies. And guess what? The Saudis are already doing that. They've got billions already in Tesla, for example, and they are investing in alternative technologies. So it's a win-win almost if they carry on doing that. It's sort of what you're talking about. We need to use the energy to try and invest in other energy.
Yeah, at the same time, that raises the entire political conflict level of our crazy society these days, because you have to get the Saudis on side to say, let's use your oil rather than somebody else's, and they're going to say, we're depleting our oil, what happens to our revenue in future? And there's going to be all sort of conflict over that as well. So it is a very, very difficult point that human society is coming into over this, and it certainly can't all be solved by putting up a price on carbon.
No. Direct investment, probably more the case, and as you say, rationing, so that we're using the energy we have got to try and manage that transition.
Yeah, and of course, to get rationing, you have to get political agreement on a scale which normally only occurs when you have an existential threat and people realize it is one. And that's one of the great advantages of the Nazis. Everybody realized they were as an existential threat. So the level of acceptance of things like rationing was enormous. We to get to the stage where global warming has the same impact, even the global warming deniers are going to have to say, holy hell, that was one hell of a cyclone. I lost my house, I lost my car, I lost my dog, I lost my guns. Maybe I'm wrong. And
problem with rationing is, though, that everyone gets rationed by the same amount. There's really no point in me being rich.
Well, that's exactly the point. We need to get to that situation because we'll let the rich get far too rich with the accumulation of wealth, the rising levels of debt as well, which have said benefit the rich rather than the poor. All this sort of stuff has made an enormous inequality in our society. Again, the point that you got out of Piketty's work, that we have probably the highest level of inequality possibly in the history of human civilization, at the same time as we're running out of. We've pushed the exploitation of the physical world beyond what it itself can cope with without causing climatic feedback and indeed species extinction as well. So in that particular mess, yes, the rich are going to have to realize, gee, we got all that money and we can't spend it on toys. Tough shit.
Do you know what? It sounds radical, but it also sounds plausible, doesn't it? The idea that in 10 years you're told you can only use so much energy per person, that doesn't sound beyond the realm of possibility, does it?
No, which is, of course, it would have been beyond the realm of possibility 40 or 50 years ago. But because we've delayed for so long, and the oil companies themselves have played a major role in delaying by funding things like the obfuscation about whether climate change is actually happening and so on, in the same way that big tobacco obfuscated about the dangers of tobacco with cancer. But in terms of the long term, in fact, far more dangerous even than that was. We're doing it far too late. So in that situation, you look and say, well, who actually made us wait this long? Was it the rich or was it the poor? Gee, it was the rich. You guys can complain all you like. As Nick Hanauer says famously, the pitchforks are coming. So there's at a certain point, people don't put up with that argument anymore. And I think the fact we're seeing protests about extinction in the UK, we're seeing the Gilets jaunes in France. This is not just an economic issue anymore. This is politics.
It's like that movie Network. I'm going to yell out the window, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. That's where we're at.
Every day.
That's how I get up in the morning. All right, very good. Great to talk. We'll catch you again soon. And we're going to talk about the collaborative economy next time, the sharing economy. All right, see you then.
Okay, bye.
And that's it. That's the Debunking Economics podcast for today. That was Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. We will both be back again very soon. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.